Hi class, in this video I'm going to show you how to create answer files to automate the deployment of Windows Server from our WDS server. So I've connected to ACE-IT and I'm going to click on the console of the WDS. Now I can create these answer files on my Windows 10 box, then copy them to the WDS. Just to make it easy, I'm just going to create them directly on the WDS. But generally, people create the answer files on their client machine. So I'm going to sign in as join domain. Join domain is a local admin. So join domain should be able to install software. And I'm going to install Chrome first because this only has Internet Explorer on the image. So I'm going to go to local server on the server manager. And I'm going to turn this off, i.e. enhanced security configuration. Make sure it's off for users and administrators. What that does is it locks down the Internet Explorer and doesn't allow it to run any scripts. So if you try to install something, it's just going to fail. So I'm going to search for Chrome. I'm going to download and install Chrome. Okay, Chrome's installed. So now I'm going to search for ADK. Hold on 1 second, it's not quite done. I'm going to close out of Internet Explorer. I'm going to pause it while it's installing. Okay, it's installed. So now I'm going to search for an ADK Windows Deployment Kit for Windows 10. I'm going to relaunch it. ADK for Windows 10. I'm going to click download and install Windows ADK. The latest version of Windows ADK, or the last few versions of Windows ADK, don't run properly. There's always one little glitch that we find during the lab. So I'm going to go back to the last ADK that I know that had no issues. Little things like you can't run the 64-bit version, or you can't, or it doesn't do this, or crashes after you get halfway through the lab. So just to avoid that, I'm going to go to other ADK downloads. And the one that I know doesn't have issues is ADK for Windows 10 version 1607. You can try others. I'm just going to do this one because I know it doesn't have issues. So I'm going to open it. And this is the tools needed to create WinPE disk, and it's also the tools needed to create answer files. That's what we need it for. An answer file is an XML file that we're going to push out to the image when we deploy it, and instead of asking us all the questions like your locale, accept the end user license agreement, create user accounts, that's all going to be in the answer file so it doesn't prompt us for that information. So I'm going to install it. If you're doing this for a corporation, you might want to download it so you don't have to do this because right now it's going to download the software every time I do this. If I run this option, it'll download it. So from that point on, you'll always have it downloaded. Every time you need to do a new install, you don't have to reinstall it. You don't have to re-download it. So it might save you some bandwidth. But I'm only going to do a one-time installation, so I'm just going to choose this option. This option pre-downloads it, so once it's downloaded, you don't have to download it again next time you're doing an installation. So I'm going to install it. Click Next. Sorry, I think I skipped to the screen. It's asking, do you want to give them information about what you're doing with this product? I'm just going to say Next. Accept the end user license agreement. And the stuff that I need there's a lot of nice tools in this utility that I'm not using. This user state migration tool, it's kind of nice. It allows you to deploy an image, copy the user settings from that image, meaning all the user's data, to a server, and then when you deploy the new image, it copies the user data back. This right here, this Microsoft User Experience Virtualization, allows you to set up profile disk. Normally profiles, a user profile is stored on a network server, so no matter where the user signs in, it will they'll have the same experience on any desktop that they sign in because you have something called a roaming profile. This will allow you to set up something called profile disk. It's going to be like a virtual hard disk, so every time that they sign into a machine, it will mount that hard disk and they'll have the profile locally. But if they sign into two different machines, it'll be out of sync because you can't mount a virtual hard disk to two machines at the same time. So what this will do is, if they sign into two different machines, it will sync those virtual hard disks together all the time. So that's kind of a nice tool. There's all kind of things in here that you can play around with, but for right now, I just need the deployment tools and the Windows pre-installation environment, which is the WinPE disk. So you can create your own custom WinPE disk. So I'm going to click Install. Click Yes. This takes about 3 minutes, so I'm going to pause the video. Okay, it's done installing, so I'm going to close this window out and close down the browser. The next thing I need to do is I need to copy 2 files off the installation DVD. So we still have our DVD inserted in our machine. I'm going to go back to the lab to show you that. In our last lab, we've inserted the Windows installation CD in the WDS server. So I'm going to open up the DVD, go to the sources folder, and up in the right hand corner, I'm going to filter out any file except for files that have WIM in it. The one I need, the two that I need actually, are the install WIM, and we talked about that. That's the images that we install to the hard disk, and the boot WIM, those are images that we use to boot their remote machines, the client machines to. So I'm going to right click, copy, then I'm going to paste them in the documents folder. Guys, I've had problems when I've copied only the install WIM. I don't really need the boot WIM, but for some reason, if they're not in the same directory, I was having problems when I first started doing this. So it's been my habit to always copy both files. In actuality, you only need the install WIM. That's the only one we use. I haven't tested it in a while. I'm not copying the boot WIM, but it's so small, I copy it anyways. The reason why I have to copy them is because the ADK opens these disks up and it writes a catalog file. A DVD I can't is read only, so I can't write to that DVD, so I have to copy them to a writable location. Whenever you copy a file from the DVD, excuse me, it's read only. So I need to right click it, go to properties, and unselect read only. Then I need to do the same for the boot WIM. So now that I have those two files in a writable location, I'm going to close this out and I'm going to launch ADK. So now I'm going to launch Windows System Image Manager. I'm going to expand it. Each version of Windows, whether it be Server or Windows 10, they might ask different questions when you do the installation. So we need to load the image up so it knows what questions are that it could possibly ask. So you need to build something called a catalog file that lets you have the ability to choose which options you want to answer. So I'm going to right click right here, select a Windows image. I'm going to choose the install WIM. Remember, this image file contains 4 images. Windows Server without a graphic interface, Windows Server with a graphic interface, Windows Data Center with no graphic interface, and Windows Data Center with a graphic interface. So I'm going to click Open. It's asking, which do I want to create an answer file for? I want to do Windows Server Standard. That's Windows Server with a graphic interface. Click OK. Click Yes. Now it's going to create a catalog file. It's going to make a change to your hard disk. So I'm going to go to that documents location. And in a little bit, it's going to create an answer file. A catalog file. If you didn't unselect read only, you'll get an error right now. On newer versions of Windows ADK, this would crash at this point. So if you uninstalled the 64-bit version and installed the 32-bit version, some people have had luck. But for me, I just went back to version 1607 just to avoid any problems. For some reason, this takes an obscene amount of time. So I'm going to pause the video, let it do its thing. Hi everyone, it crashed on me once. So what I did was, I went to the documents folder, I deleted the boot WIM, then I emptied my trash bin, and I also right-clicked and uninstalled Chrome. I don't need it anymore. The reason why it crashed is because I'm running out of disk space. So before it crashes on you, delete the boot WIM, uninstall Chrome. Okay, now my catalog is created. Again, I had that issue with the disk being full, so I deleted the boot WIM, I uninstalled Chrome, re-added the image by right-clicking, select the image, and go through that process again. What you end up with is this catalog file. Now we're ready to create an answer file. So I'm going to go up here, right-click, and say New Answer File. Click File, Save Answer File As, and I'm going to show you why in a little bit, but I'm going to go to C. I'm going to put it inside of the remote install folder. And I'm going to call it Windows Server 2019 WinPE. The reason why I'm calling this because I'm going to have a bunch of different answer files. One for Windows 10. Oh, every time you want to create a custom image, you're going to create a different answer file. And when we deploy an image over the network, it has two stages. The first stage is the copy section. Then the second stage after a reboot is where you customize it, where you enter your locale and things like that. Accept the end user license agreement, create user accounts. Well, in between those two stages, it reboots. So we're going to supply one answer file. It'll be pushed out to the image. It'll use that to answer all the questions for the first stage. And then when it reboots, this is erased from memory. So then we're going to create a second answer file for the second part after the reboot. So this is the first part where we're booting to the WinPE. So this is going to answer the questions for the first part where we boot to WinPE. So I'm going to click Save. And I know this from experience, guys, so I'm just going to walk you through it. There's 7 stages to the installation. Right now, we're going to be dealing with the WinPE stage. Later, we're only going to be dealing with the specialized stage in the OOBE, which stands for out-of-the-box experience. So when you get a brand new computer and you open it up for the first time and you boot it up for the first time, those questions that I ask you initially, those are called out-of-the-box experience. So this stage that we're doing right now is going to prep it for the out-of-box experience. The out-of-box experience is after the reboot, after all the files have been copied to the hard disk and we're booting up to actually the Windows image on the hard disk. We're no longer booted to the WinPE image. So the first thing it asked us was to go to the deployment server and sign in. So I'm going to go into look for sorry, I'm reading a document right now. Just to show you what I'm reading. Guys, I already have these answer files created. I've uploaded them to D2L. They're right here. So if you don't go through this process, here's a copy of the 2 files that I'm creating. So I'm reading the first file right now. So I'm going to go to Windows, Setup. Now, you want to be very aware that there's 2 different types of files with the same exact name. We are doing a 64-bit deployment. You want to make sure that you have the 64-bit deployment. Don't go down and choose some other deployment. Stick to the Windows 64-bit, which is AMD 64. So I'm going to go down to AMD 64, Windows setup and expand that. Then I'm going to go down to Windows Deployment Services and expand that. I'm going to right click it and add it to pass 1. So these are the questions that it's going to ask me, and now I need to supply the answer. First thing it did was it asked us to sign in. So I'm going to go here and supply my domain name, Contoso. The password that we use is capital PA11WRD. And the user account name we're going to use is join domain. So if you remember in the last video where I actually did an installation, these are the credentials I supplied. Then it's asking, what image do we want to install? So I'm going to go back to the server manager, to tools, and I'm going to launch Windows Deployment Services. I'll expand my server. I'm going to go down to install images, expand image group 1. Then I'm going to double click on this image. The thing that it has highlighted, I'm going to copy it. That's the name of the image. So now I'm going to take that and go back to the Windows System Manager, System Image Manager, and under the image name, I'm going to paste that. Then I'm going to go back to Windows Deployment Service. I'm going to highlight image group name and copy that. Go back to the System Image Manager and paste it under image group. Go back to WDS, and the actual file name is install.wim. I'm going to highlight that, copy it, and press cancel. That's the last thing I need. Go back and paste it in here. So when we deployed with the WDS, the first thing it asked us was what, to sign into the WDS server remotely, and then it asked us what image we want to choose. Then once we have the image, it's asking where to install it. We're going to install it on disk 0. Disks are enumerated starting with 0, and partitions are enumerated starting with 1. So the first partition is going to be an EFI system partition. Because we're booting to a Generation 2 machine, we don't have an MBR. What we have is something called an EFI system partition. That's going to hold our partition table. So we're not going to install Windows to that. We're going to install Windows to the second partition, which is our system partition. That's the partition that's going to hold our operating system. The first partition holds our partition table. The second partition holds the actual operating system, in this case Windows Server. We're going to create those partitions here in a little bit. So the next thing we need to do is, during the installation, it asks us how we wanted to partition our hard disk. And we just clicked install and let it automatically partition. Well, we don't have an automatic partition with answer files. You have to manually specify those partitions. So I'm going to go, and under AMD Microsoft Windows Setup, I'm going to expand disk configuration, expand disk, then expand create partition. I'm going to expand create partitions. I'm going to highlight create partition. Right click, add it to pass 1. we need to create two partitions. The first partition for our partition table, and the second partition for our system. So we need two partitions, one for our partition table and one for our operating system. So we need to add this twice. Again, I highlighted create partition, not create partitions. Once we create the partition, we need to format them. So we need to modify the partition. Do it twice. I'm just going to show you the disk on this machine to show you those two partitions. So I'm going to go to the disk manager just so you can see them. So this disk 0 has two partitions. This is the EFI partition that holds my partition table. If I right click it, well, it's a little bit different on these virtual machines, but that's my EFI system partition. And this is going to be the partition that holds my operating system. This is my DVD drive. So we need to create these two partitions. So I'm going to close this out. And the first one we're going to do is, we're going to create a partition. We're going to highlight the first create partition. The order is 1. The size is 150. Guys, if I press F1 right now, I can't do it because my real machine is, let me see if I can do this. If I press F1, it's going to show me help. For that particular option I'm choosing. So right now I'm dealing with this. If you need to know more information about it, you can press F1 and it will give you some help. It's really good. It's very detailed help. So in this case, I'm going to be creating a 150 megabyte partition. It doesn't need to be very big because it's just holding a partition table. Something called GUID. I'm going to type that out so you can see how I spell it. Global unique ID. Every partition is going to have a global unique ID. Those global unique IDs will be stored in the first partition. So I'm going to close this out. And the type of it will be an EFI partition. Generation 2 machines, I forget what this acronym means, but that's going to be the partition that holds our partition table. So now I'm going to go to the next create partition. This is going to be the second partition we're going to create. Up here for extend, I'm going to choose true, meaning I don't need to put a size in here because I'm going to use the rest of the disk. So it's going to be the second partition I create, and I'm going to use the rest of the disk. And it's going to be a primary partition. This will be the partition where I install the operating system. So after it creates the two partitions, we need to modify them. So the order will be 1. This will be the first disk, or the first partition. The partition ID will be 1. And the format will be FAT32. Because when you're booting up, it doesn't load the NTFS drivers, so it won't be able to read this partition to know what partitions there are. if we format it NTFS. So that EFI partition has to be FAT32 because the operating system isn't loaded at the point that this is read, which means the NTFS drivers to read an NTF disk isn't in memory. We don't need to give it a drive letter because it's not something end users need to be messing with. We don't need a label or anything like that. So the next partition we're going to modify is the partition with our operating system. So this will be order 2. It will be partition 2. I'm going to give it a label of Windows. And the format is going to be NTFS. Now here's where it gets a little tricky. Because this is a generation 2, it's going to label this as an EFI partition automatically. So what we need to do is, I'm going to open up a command prompt. I'm going to run a command called disk part. It's going to elevate me. So now I'm running this as the administrator. If I type help, I can see a bunch of help. I want to do help set ID. I want to look at the different types of GUIDs I can use for this partition. I'm going to scroll up. So by default, it wants to give it this ID because it's a generation 2 machine, so it thinks it's an EFI system partition. Well, end users don't mess with system partition. So if you have any partition with this GUID, at that point, your end users won't be able to do anything. So you won't be able to read it to boot to it or anything like that. So we need to label our Windows partition with as a basic data partition. So if you have this GUID, that partition is going to be locked down. You can't install the operating system on a partition that's locked down. It assumes this GUID for any generation 2 machines. We need to have a basic data partition to install the operating system on. So I'm going to highlight that one, then copy it. Then type exit twice to get out, or exit twice to get out. Make sure you don't copy any spaces. So once you copy it, paste it in there. So when it formats this partition, it knows it's going to be just a regular data partition that user can assign a drive letter to and actually see. Did I not copy it right? Oh, sorry. The partition ID is to the type ID is your GUID. Sorry guys. Order is 2, the partition number is 2, the type ID, that's my GUID. That's the GUID of a basic data partition. And lastly, we need to give it a drive letter of C. So we created 2 partitions, modified 2 partitions. And then I'm going to go up here to the disk. Earlier I said I'm going to install it to disk 0. So I need to label this as disk 0. If you're perfect, like me, you'll be able to do this right the first time. When we put a new disk in there, it's going to be blank. So it'll be able to create these partitions. But if you mess up and you have to do this a second time, you need to clear that disk out. So I like to always say, wipe the disk before doing anything. So your disk 0, we're going to wipe it. The first time through, there's nothing to wipe. But if you mess up and you do it a second time, or you're deploying an image to a machine that's already been deployed to once, this will wipe the disk, then create these partitions. Once it creates the partitions, it'll grab the image from the WDS server that we specified and install the image to that disk using the credentials that we supplied. So now I want to make sure I have no typos. So I'm going to click this little button here to make sure I have no typos. I did. I have no typos, no warning, no errors. Now I'm going to save it. Now I'm going to create an answer file for the second portion of the installation after the reboot. Up until this point, I'm booted to the WinPE disk in memory. When it reboots, it's going to actually boot to the operating system. I'm going to pause the video for a minute. Okay. Sorry, someone came in my house. My dog goes crazy every time someone comes in. So now I'm going to create a new answer file. Guys, don't forget to click save. Otherwise, if you don't click save, nothing will be there. If you're just watching this video and not following along, that's fine because I have the two answer files here on D2L. So I'm going to right click and create a new answer file. Then I'm going to click File, Save Answer File As. Windows Server 2019 OOBE. And then click Save. Now, this is going to be after the reboot that you would normally experience if you bought a brand new PC and took it out of the box. So the two passes we're dealing with in here will be the Specialized and the OOBE. Now, I'm just doing a basic configuration, but you can really customize your images to do anything you want. You can install additional software, you can run additional commands. I'm just going to do a basic setup to answer all the questions that are required. So I'm going to go to I'm going to collapse this. I'm going to go to Windows Shell Setup. Give me 1 second. I think I might have forgotten something with the other answer file. I did. So guys, I'm going to open up the other answer file. I skipped something. I'm going to right click, open an answer file, and I'm going to choose this WinPE. I'm going to go to look for AMD 64 Windows International Core WinPE. I'm going to expand that, then highlight language setup, and add it to pass 1. I forgot to do this, guys. Basically, what happens is during the setup, it asks you what keyboard and what language you want to do the setup in. So I'm going to type ENUS. You can't have any typos here. Actually, you can't have any typos anywhere. And then I was going to set up UI language. Then I'm going to go up here and do it again. For input locale, EN-US. The layer drivers, I'm not doing EN-US. If you don't have any drivers that you're added to your WinPE, that just generates an error. So I'm skipping layer drivers. The user interface language I want to use is also English. The fallback language is English. If you don't have a language pack installed, you always have to put a fallback. And the user locale is also English. And that basically defines the character set you use for your keyboard. Okay, so guys, I forgot to add that. These are some questions that I'd ask you when you first boot up, what language you want to use to do the installation. So again, I'm going to validate it. I have no warnings, and save it. Guys, and again, if you want to make changes to your answer file, you just open up this utility and make changes to your answer file. Now I'm going to save it again. Now I'm going to back to my new answer file. So I'm going to go to Open Answer File and choose the one that's OOBE. So I'm going to look for the question of my computer name. So I'm going to find AMD 64 Microsoft Windows Setup. And I'm going to look. This is kind of weird, guys. When I add the parent, it's going to add all the child objects. But I don't want all the child objects. I just want this parent. So I'm going to right click. Give me 1 second. This doesn't seem right. Sorry, I want to look for AMD Microsoft Windows Shell Setup. This one, sorry. So I want to add this. When I add this, it adds all the child objects. So I'm going to right click AMD 64 Microsoft Windows Shell Setup and add it to Specialized. Guys, I keep referring back to my answer file. That's why I keep hesitating, because if you look at the answer file, it's just like looking at HTML code. It's kind of hard to read. So for all these ones that I don't need, I'm just highlighting and then pressing the delete key. You know, these are like features I can install. I'm not worried about that. I'm only worried about things that are required. So for computer name. Guys, remember going through the last video when I deployed an image, I did name and approve? Well, here's where I supply the name in my answer file. I'm going to use an environmental variable called machine name. It begins with a %, ends in a %, and it's all uppercase. So when I do name and approve, it assigns that name to an environmental variable called %, machine name, %. So when it reads this in the answer file, it takes it and assigns it to that variable and then sets the computer name based on that. The next thing I'm going to do is set the product ID. Guys, there's some product IDs that are out there that are just for this purpose. Just so you can put in your answer file to deploy an image without having to manually go to that image and type a product ID. There's something called a KMS server, a key management server. When your machine boots up in modern networks, it goes to the key management server, checks out a license, and when you shut down the machine, it releases that license to another machine. So we just need one product ID just to do the deployment. From that point on, when it needs a product ID, it'll check it out from the server, check it back in once it's done, once that machine is shut down. So this is just a product ID just for the deployment. You can do a search on the Microsoft's website for deployment product IDs. You have to find which version of Windows you have and use the appropriate product ID. Guys, I've already done that. You can do a search on the Microsoft website or Google and find a whole list of product IDs. Now, you can't activate the machine with this product IDs. You can just use it to get past this point during the installation. You don't want it to prompt you for the product ID. When I went through it manually, I said I'll supply it later. I'm just going to make sure I have no typos. Okay, the next thing I need to do is set the time zone. This is something that asked me during the installation. Again, no typos. If we were in class, someone would ask, is it case sensitive? I don't know. I've never tested it. I've always typed it like this. It's always worked. Guys, and basically, here's how I figured out how to use this utility. I installed an operating system, wrote down all the questions that asked me, came here and looked for those things that would answer those questions. And if I was confused about anything, I hit F1 to get help on that topic. Okay, the next thing I want to do is look for another thing called, right here, Microsoft Windows Unattended Join. And I want to go down to credentials and add to the specialized pass. Under credentials, I'm going to put in Contoso. The password is capital PA11WRD. I'm going to join it to the domain as join domain. Guys, our WDS server should do this automatically, but it doesn't. So I'm putting this in here because, one time out of 10 it'll work fine. The other 9 times it doesn't. But if I put this in here, it always joins the client to the domain. So when I deploy an image, I want it to automatically be part of the domain. So I'm going to go I filled in the credentials field. I'm going to go over to identification, and under this unsecured join field, I'm going to change it to true. I don't need to fill out any of this, but if you wanted to, you could change it to move it to a different a different OU instead of the default computer container. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do here. I only need this. These are credentials I'm going to use to join it to the domain, and I'm going to allow it to do it unsecurely just so I know it positively joined the domain. The next section I want to search for is back to Windows Shell Setup. So I'm going back to AMD Microsoft Windows Shell Setup, and I'm going to expand OOBE, out of the box experience. I want to add this, but I don't want to add the child. So I have to add the parent. I'm going to add it to pass 7, OOBE. And I'm going to delete the child. I only need this. Okay, so I'm going to hide the end user license agreement. So when a user is watching it install, I don't want them to see that. I want to hide the account creation screen. If a user can see it, they might be able to interact with it and do something and mess it up. So you want to hide these screens so they don't even see it, so they can't click on anything and mess anything up. If this was like a Dell laptop or a Gateway laptop, they would have that OEM registration. I want to hide the section where I created an online Microsoft account. I might not want to hide this. I might want the user to interact with this. If it's a laptop, do you want the end user to be able to join it to the wireless network? If it was a laptop with Windows 10, I would say yes. But for this, it's going to be Windows Server, which we're not going to install on a laptop anyway, so there won't be any wireless. So for this installation, I'm going to choose true. For Windows 10, I might leave it as false or blank. The window locale. I'm going to press F1. You can kind of see what it's asking for down here. But I'm going to press F1 to show you. Is this computer going to be used in their home, work, or other? This is going to be used in a work environment. Work environment or the home environment, what they do is it relaxes the firewall so it can discover devices on your network. Other, it doesn't do that. Your firewall is closed up as if you were in a Starbucks or something like that. So I'm going to choose work. You ever notice when you buy a computer from Dell, HP, or Gateway, there's all this other bloatware? Well, that's not actually part of the image. In the answer file that Dell puts in there, or Gateway or HP puts in there, they put their app ID in there. So it can go to the Windows Store and download all that software. We don't have it, but if you're deploying to an OEM laptop and you want it to look back to a pristine state like a user just bought it, you might want to find out the app ID so it can load all that additional software. Sometimes you might need this because that additional software might include a driver or something like that that you need for that hardware. For me, I'm doing it through a virtual machine, it'll be fine. Protect your PC. What do we want to do with Windows updates? we can use a 1, 2, or 3. If you don't know what 1, 2, or 3 means, press F1. 1 specifies that important and recommended updates are automatically installed. 2 is only important updates are installed. 3 doesn't do anything. It basically doesn't install any updates. So I'm going to use 1. I'm not going to skip the out of the box experience. I'm just going to hide everything. This is if you want to set it up for a demo. Like if you're a retail shop like Best Buy and you want that laptop to be sitting on the counter so people can play with it, you can install that demo software. But again, you need that OEM app ID. The next thing I'm going to do is go to user accounts. And I want to set the local admin password. Now, if this is Windows 10, you also need to create a local account because the admin account is by default disabled. So you can create a local account and add it to, you can kind of see over here, add it to your local admins group. Because the default administrator account is disabled in Windows 10. So if you don't add a local account and it fails to join the domain, you won't have any account that you can use to sign into the machine. So make sure you create a local account. If this is Windows 10, add it to the local administrators group. So if you don't join the domain, you'll have at least one account you can sign into to manually add it to the domain. So for us, this is not Windows 10, this is Windows Server. I don't know why I can't type here. So we're just going to use our standard password. On Windows Server, the local admin account is active, so we don't have to worry about creating a local account. And lastly, guys, you notice that when I type in the value, these boxes become dark blue. That's because they're populated with data. You can't add a component, basically a question, and not supply an answer. If you have anything here that is not dark blue, you have to remove it. Otherwise, when we validate it, it won't validate. So the next thing we need to add is our installation language. So last time we did, on the first answer file, we did AMD 64 Microsoft Windows International Core WinPE. Now we're just going to do International Core. Again, because we're no longer booting to WinPE. So I'm going to right click this and add this to the OOBE system. Guys, it took a lot of experimenting to know where to install things. Like this can be installed in Specialized or OOBE. From my experience, I know that we're dealing with the out-of-the-box experience, so I'm going to add it to that. There's no way for you to know off the top of your head. You just have to play around with it. In this particular case, it's hear me now, believe me later. It needs to go in pass 7. Some things can be added to multiple passes. This is one of them. what we're doing right now, it needs to be added to pass 7. So again, our input language will be, or input locale will be in US. Our language we're going to use to do the install is, this out-of-the-box experience is US. The fallback language will be US. This is case sensitive. And the user locale will be US. Okay, so now we need to validate it. And save it. So now we've created 2 answer files. I'm going to close this out. I'm going to go back to WDS. Now we need to add these answer files to WDS. I could get to WDS from the server manager, go to Tools, Windows Deployment Services. The first place I want to add an answer file is the WinPE answer file. So I'm going to go down to my image, highlight my server installation image, right-click it, and go to Properties. Here at the bottom, I'm going to allow image to install in unattended mode. I'm going to check that box and browse for the file. I put that under C, Remote Install. I'm going to choose the WinPE image. If you already have an answer file there, it's going to override it. Guys, if you make a change to the answer file, you need to go back here and re-add it. Click OK. Click OK. That was for the first part of the installation before the reboot. Now I want to add the answer file for the OOBE portion of the installation. I'm going to highlight our server. I'm going to right click, go to Properties. And under Client, I want to supply another answer file for the OOBE. So I'm going to enable Unattended Installation. And this is going to be a UEFI architecture, meaning a 64-bit Gen 2 machine. So that's the type of virtual machines we're deploying. So I'm going to click Browse. I'm going to choose the OOBE answer file. Then click OK. Oh, incidentally, guys, you notice that I can't go any higher. Oh, actually, it is working, but I'm not going to explain it. But I put the answer files as a remote install location for a reason. In 2016, it wouldn't allow me to go outside of the remote install folder. So that's why I put them there. 2019, apparently it's allowing me to go anywhere I want. Okay. Again, if you make changes to this answer file, you have to go back in here and re-add the answer file after you save your changes. Click OK. So guys, I'm going to do the test deployment. I've never deployed a virtual machine with answer files inside of ACE-IT, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to stop this video now, test it manually before I record it. So I'll see you in the next video.